It seems like the announcements of last year's E3 are still rotating in our heads, yet companies like Bethesda and Microsoft are already announcing the dates for their upcoming E3 press conferences. E3 is an event unlike any other and certainly exceptional to the games industry. While Comic-Con might feature a few exciting movie trailers and announcements outside of the comic book movie realm, all in all it is very much focused on the superhero movie cosmos. Just imagine every Comic-Con would include the announcement of hundreds of upcoming movie releases, from small indie productions to giant long-awaited blockbuster movies. Only then would you begin to grasp the sheer excitement and anticipation millions of gamers experience every year when the biggest publishers and companies call to arms, participating in a battle of heavy hardware and game announcements, all for our entertainment.
Are you not entertained?
Yes, E3 is something truly special and a unique byproduct of the video game industry, but let's face it, as much as we all love it, every year we complain about the same old flaws. E3 press conferences are in and of themselves a treat for game enthusiasts, but that doesn't mean they don't contain many annoying conventions that spoil the pacing and enjoyment of the presentation. Everyone who kept track of the press conferences during the last couple of years knows what I'm talking about. Excessive marketing gibberish, embarrassing stage presentations, and many other cringeworthy aspects have been a thorn in our flesh for far too long. Ultimately, we all knew there's room for improvement. Since E3 2017 is only a few months away, I want to take the opportunity to risk a closer look at E3 2016, especially at Sony's conference. For many, Sony's showcase at last year's E3 was the wet dream of every gamer. I expected a strong conference, but nothing prepared for such a spectacular and bold move on the part of Sony. For the first time in a long time, I was more than just pleasantly surprised after an E3 press conference. I was blown away. To be clear, it wasn't without flaws, but it was as close as possible to something I would call the perfect E3 press conference. It certainly was the best conference I have ever seen, with barely any room for improvement. If you are a core gamer, chances are fairly high you will agree. Sony finally created a show that was in its essence addressed to a hardcore gamer audience. Whatever the purpose of E3 may have been in the past, nowadays it clearly is perceived as a giant entertainment event. Its main purpose is to please and entertain the fans and not to appeal to shareholders. If you think about it, it's actually kind of misrepresentative that the keynotes are still called press conferences. They may have been press conferences when E3 was still in its infancies, but if you recall the last couple of Sony conferences, it becomes unmistakably clear that E3 is all about delivering an awesome show, and that's exactly what Sony provided with last year's E3 conference. E3 turned from an industry-only event into a showing that opened its doors to the general public more and more. In fact, this year's E3 will be the first ever E3 to grant the general public access, which ultimately transforms E3 into something that is much more comparable to Gamescom, instead of an event focusing on advertising its products to investors and games media only. Sony seemed to be aware of that, as they were the only company with a truly magnificent venue, namely the historic Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. They were the only ones who had a proper setting for an actual show. It looked like a giant opera or old-school cinema compared to the cold and bland press rooms of everyone else. The setting certainly set the tone and underlined the topic of the show, that is to say, the celebration of art, in this case incredible video games. Before I start to analyze the structure of Sony's conference, I probably should clarify what aspects define an incredible E3 conference. Please keep in mind, all this is highly subjective, so you might disagree with certain points I make. A well-made E3 press conference or show, let's face it, it's a show, should fulfill the following key elements. Engaging pacing. Not only movies have to take pacing into consideration, an E3 conference should be just as vigilant about a well-paced order of events, because ultimately it wants to achieve the same objective: entertain the crowd. Just like a story implements moments of emotional high points and slower paced moments to give your audience room to breathe and process the prior events, a show that is supposed to please a giant crowd of gamers should structure its game announcements after the same principle. Marketing talk, or talking in general, should be kept to a minimum, and sometimes it's wiser to kick out a few game announcements in order to keep a captivating pacing, instead of squeezing as many announcements as possible into a conference. The right mix of gameplay demos and trailers is key. Focus on games. Show, don't tell is the motto. Instead of flowered speeches about a game, why don't you just show it to us, since everyone can decide for himself if the game is indeed amazing or not. As gamers, we are first and foremost interested in games, so please center your conference about the right mixture of surprising announcements and expected but eagerly awaited sequels to already existing franchises. The showcased games should not only be surprising, but also cover a great variety of genres. Diversity is crucial because our gaming community has a diverse taste. Focus on fans. Prove to us why we made the right decision to support your particular platform. Give us a reason to be excited about the future of your system. I bought a PS4 for $400, now show me what amazing software the future holds for my console. What are the gaming experiences unique to your console? Obviously, this point only applies to console manufacturers like Nintendo, Sony and Microsoft. You could find all these points in Sony's conference. The entire show was centered on the motto that basically summarizes all three aspects: show, don't tell. Sony managed to differentiate itself from all the other conferences right from the get-go by setting the tone for what is about to come in the most epic and memorable way possible. Letting a live orchestra accompany the whole evening and every trailer and gameplay demo was a ballsy move that paid off beautifully. From the fancy venue to the orchestra, everything equipped the show with a sense of weight and seriousness, but in a good way. Video games are an incredible form of art and we shouldn't be ashamed to make a big deal about them. They deserve it. Sony delivered one hell of an opening. And you know what's so sad about all of this? The orchestra playing the main theme of the new God of War game reminded me of a similar situation in another E3 conference. It reminded me of Nintendo's 2011 E3 conference, which likewise started with a live orchestra playing Zelda music. Compare that to Nintendo's latest E3 showings, if they even had one. Sony's show was light on filler and featured a rapid fire of high caliber game announcements brimming with surprises. In fact, only 3 people walked on stage during the entire conference and never interrupted the pacing with expansive speeches. Sean Layden entered the stage 4 times, Andrew House only once, and Kojima literally only entered the stage to say,
"I'm back!"
and introduce his new game. That's it. Combined, they talked less than 10 minutes. This means the lion's share of the conference was filled with games and only games. Andrew House and Kojima both talked less than a minute, and whenever Sean Layden had something to say, it was actually combined with surprising announcements like the return of Crash Bandicoot. It's also remarkable that Sony showcased more AAA games than any other publisher. Don't get me wrong here, the quality of a game shouldn't be measured by its production budget. Indie games have become more and more important due to their sheer quantity and in many cases quality. During the last years, certain indie games impressed me more than most AAA productions. However, I think there are better occasions to reveal indie games of the like of Inside or Firewatch. E3 is known for its massive array of long-awaited AAA announcements, so chances are high smaller indie games get buried under high-caliber announcements like God of War or Death Stranding. When it comes to Sony, they would be far better off announcing an intriguing slate of indie games at PlayStation Experience. While PSX also features great reveals like, believe it or not, The Last of Us Part 2, it's obviously focused on games that would be swallowed during E3. Sony's E3 conference felt so entertaining and energetic because their conference featured the highest amount of massive AAA announcements while also being one of the shortest of all conferences. The entire conference wasn't longer than 1 hour and 20 minutes. That's it. Microsoft's conference was 1.5 hours long, so was Nintendo's Treehouse if you want to count that as a conference, and Ubisoft's conference was the longest with 2 hours length. The only conferences shorter than Sony's were the ones of Bethesda and EA. Bethesda delivered a good show just like the year before. Same could not be said about EA. Like every year, EA's conference was above all else boring and lifeless. In many ways, EA's conference was the perfect antithesis to Sony's, but I will get to this in a sec. Soak the following facts in for a moment. Sony's conference was only 1 hour and 19 minutes long, but during this time span the most notable games were God of War, Days Gone,
I remember when we lived by a code, when brotherhood meant something, and living meant more than surviving.
The Last Guardian, Horizon Zero Dawn, Detroit, Resident Evil 7, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare,
Raj, let's get there.
We got hostiles!
the Crash Bandicoot Remastered Trilogy, Death Stranding,
Soon I'll come around. Lost and never found.
and Insomniac Spider-Man. Eight of these games are PlayStation 4 exclusives, of which 5 were presented during the first 30 minutes of the show. In a million years I wouldn't have guessed that we would see the 5 biggest Sony exclusives after half an hour into the conference. There was hardly any breathing room. Sony indeed showed and didn't just tell. EA's conference was the exact opposite. It was a poor showing, which is bizarre considering the fact that EA had 2 highly anticipated games in its portfolio and was making a lot of fuss about EA Play, the first ever EA fan event, freeing itself from the clutches of the usual E3 conference space. And oh my god, was it boring. We all wanted to see Mass Effect, and we got Mass Effect, barely 2 minutes of footage jammed into a developer diary. Wow. The entire content felt extremely forced as their conference was filled with makeshift trailers and unspectacular developer diaries. EA put a lot of emphasis on celebrities whose only purpose was to tell you how awesome the games are instead of actually showcasing the games.
Like Jamie Foxx, Zac Efron are going to be on those teams. Are you guys pumped for tonight's event?
Yes.
Jazzed. Can't wait. Dude, stoked.
While EA celebrated football and movie stars, Sony's only celebrity was an actual game developer. The only star gamers should care about, someone who creates games, our favorite form of art. The lion's share of EA's 1 hour conference was the usual marketing talk.
We get it.
Although Ubisoft's conference was really strong, it was far too long, mostly because of one reason. You guessed it, talking. I understand that the upcoming Assassin's Creed movie was a big deal for Ubisoft as a company, but do you really have to spend 8 minutes of your game conference for an interview with a movie director? Like every year, Sony's biggest competitor was Microsoft. And you know what? Microsoft's conference was freaking awesome. In my opinion, it was the second best and outranked the rest by a large margin. They announced the Xbox One S, delivered gameplay for Scalebound and Gears of War, and ended the conference with the long-rumored Project Scorpio. I have to be honest with you guys, when I saw this conference my initial thought was, this is difficult to beat. But when it comes to consoles, software will always be more important than hardware. And on that front, Sony was beating its competition big time. I actually felt a little bit sad for Microsoft because although their conference was fantastic, Sony's was just so much better that every spotlight was immediately taken away and pointed at Sony. Microsoft opened and closed its conference with hardware, while Sony opened and closed its conference with massive exclusive games. Everything about Sony's conference was so well crafted, even details one would perceive as mundane. Let's take gameplay presentations as an example. Microsoft was constantly diverting attention from the actual gameplay footage to those weird out-of-place shots of the conference hall. Instead of focusing on the game, Microsoft made the strange decision to showcase a completely motionless crowd every 10 seconds, removing all attention from the actual game. This would have been reasonable if the crowd reaction would have been worth seeing. During Sony's conference, some of the crowd's reactions were actually quite amusing and interesting, since many were genuinely losing their shit during certain announcements. Therefore, Sony had a much better reason to show the hall, but they didn't. Whenever they showcased one of their games with a live gameplay presentation, they put emphasis on the actual gameplay. Of course, Sony wanted to prove that the orchestra was accompanying the footage the whole time and that everything we were seeing was actually played live as well. Instead of cutting away every few seconds like Microsoft, they chose a far more useful picture-in-picture approach. 4 small screens as proof that everything we see is indeed played and performed live, while filling the biggest amount of the screen with the gameplay. It's also worth noting that we barely got any release dates, which, considering the enormous amount of repeatedly delayed games during this console generation, actually is a positive statement rather than a negative one. Take your time and give us a release date when you are confident you can hit it. This way everyone wins and potential disappointments get minimized. It seems like Sony learned from its mistakes. Uncharted 4 turned out to be an incredible game, but was delayed 3 times in a row. I'm confident that at least one of the big Sony exclusive games will be released this holiday season. If I had to bet, I'd say Days Gone. Insomniac's Spider-Man and Death Stranding won't be coming out anytime soon. Sony probably could have given us the assumed release windows for Days Gone, God of War and Detroit, but instead simply stated they are in development. As I said, all of this may seem mundane, but if you ask me, it goes to show how perfectly thought out every element of Sony's conference was. You could even compare it to Sony's E3 2015 conference, the biggest fan fiction conference of all time. Still, I would argue that it doesn't compare to Sony's latest E3 showing. In many ways, Sony's 2015 conference was concerned with the past. The Last Guardian, Shenmue 3 and the Final Fantasy VII Remake may have been eagerly longed for by millions of gamers, but all of these titles were a celebration of the past in their own right. Sony's 2016 conference was looking into the future, with many new IPs and fresh directions of already established franchises. We also shouldn't forget that the insane announcements of 2015 overshadowed a conference that overall was far more muddled and contained many of the typical E3 annoyances than last year's E3. Like every E3 conference, it could have been trimmed down significantly if most uninspired marketing talk would have been kicked out. At one point it actually felt like one of those TV sales shows.
Today, it is our pleasure to announce a limited edition Disney Infinity 3.0 starter pack that is exclusive to PlayStation platforms. It will not only feature the Twilight of the Republic playset and characters, but also the Rise Against the Empire playset and figures 1 month before they're available on any other platform.
I fear that Sony's 2015 conference will be remembered more than their, in my opinion, far more substantial and meaningful 2016 showcase. I could spend a lot of time describing what I felt during Sony's E3 showcase, what I looked like when the curtains finally closed, but I decided to visualize it instead. It will be interesting to see if the shockwaves of Sony's legendary presentation will be able to reach this year's E3 and hopefully change many press conferences for the better. If more companies would try to imitate Sony's formula in the foreseeable future, it would be a great victory for all of us and make E3 to an even greater event. Sony's E3 press conference was not only an important victory for Sony as a publisher, but could also fulfill a role model function for future E3 showings. Let's hope Sony's 2016 conference won't be forgotten anytime soon.